Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Tom Defalco.
Thank you very much. Yikes. Hi, everybody. I am the legendary Tom Defalco. There's a reason why I'm called the legendary, which I can explain to you later if anybody's interested. You're either at my age, either you're the legendary or you're the old hack. I prefer legendary. You're probably wondering why a good-looking, personable, sweet person like myself would devote most of his professional life to comics. That's the question here. Why comics? What is it about comic books and comics that, interest us? Why are you guys here? Why do you care about comics? These are not just abstract questions. Have you ever really thought about why you care about comics? Is it because, you like all the different TV shows? And let's face it, there are a lot of TV shows now. There's, I think on the CW alone, there's 5 live action things and 2 cartoon shows. There have been hundreds of TV shows based on comics. Whoops, where's the next one? Ouch. Is it because you like the merchandise? Come on, how many of you guys have T-shirts at home with a superhero on them? Yeah, okay. We got T-shirts, toys. They got breakfast cereals now. They got all sorts of junk with comics. Or is it because of the movies? Come on, there have been a lot of popular movies based on comics, like Road to Perdition. You guys knew that was based on a comic book, right? A History of Violence, big movie. You guys knew it was based on a comic book, right? Atomic Blonde. Come on. Anybody see all these popular movies based on comics? Like, anybody see the thing called the Black Panther or Infinity Wars? I could tell from the blank faces with the other ones, you guys didn't know about all the movies based on comics. Well, in America alone, there are a few hundred movies that have been based on comics. Now, if you add in Europe, Asia, and the rest of the world, there are actually a few thousand movies based on comics. In America, the first movies were movie serials. You guys know what a movie serial is? How many of you guys know what a movie serial is? What do they teach you guys? Come on! Movie serials, back in the 30s and the 40s, movie theaters wanted the kids to come back every week. So they would show these things called movie serials, which would be about a 15, 20-minute episode of some movie like Flash Gordon that would always end on a big cliffhanger. Flash would be in a spaceship flying through the air, and suddenly the spaceship would blow up. Does this mean Flash is dead? You got to come back next week to find out. That was a movie serial. Flash Gordon, I think, was the first one. They had movie serials on Superman, Batman, Captain America, Captain Marvel, a whole bunch of movie serials. But we're not here to talk about movies, we're here to talk about comics. Now, comic books these days go by many names, graphic novels, sequential storytelling, visual literature. Now that you academics are involved, hundreds of names. I can't even keep track of them all. But I'm going to just stick with comics. And comics can be both a singular verb when you're talking about the medium, and it can also be a plural, but this is an anal retentive writing thing. Let's define what a comic is. Now, this is a gag strip. Comics can be either a single image or a sequence of images, which may or may not have copy connected to them. All they got to do is express an idea or express, an action or tell a story or what have you. The first one we saw, the single panel, that's commonly called the gag cartoon. That's kind of where we started. Where do comics come from? Well, there were these cave paintings found a while ago in I think it's Lascaux, France. My pronunciation is terrible. But those cave paintings from, 17,000 years ago are images that express ideas and tell stories for cavemen. Hieroglyphics may also be another form of comics. I'm sure you've all heard of hieroglyphics, right? You guys all know what that stuff is. There were, tapestries from the Middle Ages, and tapestries and illustrated manuscripts. Another form, of the medium in its early days. This is Guernica, or how do you pronounce it? Guernica. My pronunciation, like I said, it's terrible. But this is a very serious painting by Pablo Picasso, which again is a single image that tells the story of a bombing of a Basque village by the Nazis. Is this also part of the comic technique? Are all interpretive paintings part of the comic technique? You got to get a smarter guy than I am to tell you that answer. And, you guys can discuss it among yourselves. You'll be the judge. The first bunch of gag cartoons started to appear in magazines, like Punch, which appeared in, 1840. But I'm more interested in American stuff. And we started getting comics here in Sunday supplements, which they were on yellow paper, hence the yellow kid. And they were essentially gag cartoons that were aimed at political satire, were just jokes, things. As time went on, the cartoonists, some cartoonists decided to string a couple of panels together. And that created the, excuse me, that created the comic strip. I know newspapers are out these days, but how many of you guys know what comic strips are? Come on, okay, good. My faith in the American education system has been, validated. Comic strips, I told you that the first bunch were in Sunday supplements. Well, editors realized that people liked comic strips, so they started to put them into daily newspapers. And these things proved to be so popular that the artists, the writers who drew them, they were the celebrities of their day. This is, before movies, way before television. So the guys who drew Mutt and Jeff, that sort of thing, they became just as popular as, the Kardashians are today, if you care about that stuff. The first comic book, as we know it, was, came out in, when did it? 1933, and this featured a bunch of reprints of regular comic strips. Now, comic strips were all aimed at adults in those days because kids don't buy newspapers, adults bought newspapers. And the purpose of the comic strips was to make people, buy newspapers. First comic books, they're reprinting things like, Joe Palooka, Mutt and Jeff, a bunch of comic strips. they were essentially aimed at adults. Now the first couple of comic books came out. They sold so well that publishers said, hey, we better produce more and more of these things. Because publishers are very greedy people. Trust me, very greedy people. So they want to make as much money as they can. So they started publishing more and more comic books. Now they realized after a while that hey, there weren't that many comic strips around. So they started to hire writers and artists to create original material. And when they started off, the original material was kind of based on pulp magazines. How many of you guys know what a pulp magazine is? All right, for those who don't, these were, 10-cent magazines that had a novel and a bunch of short stories. Some were genre-aimed, Western stories, mystery stories, romance stories, whatever kind of stories, science fiction stories. Some were hero-oriented. I'm sure you guys have heard of The Shadow. Yes, come on. Doc Savage, The Spider, there were the Black Bat. There were hundreds of these masked costume guys that would run around, and that's what comic books originally started to produce once writers and artists were creating new stories. That all changed when two kids from Cleveland came up with the first superhero, Superman. Superman changed the industry. It introduced the concept of the superhero, and thousands of superheroes followed Superman. Just too many to possibly name. Comic books, featuring guys like Captain America and this guy, Captain Marvel. They sold incredible numbers. Captain Marvel used to appear in a comic book that would come out twice a month, and each issue sold over 1 million copies. They really reached their heyday. That's the original Flash. That's Submariner, who has not appeared in a Marvel movie yet, but is coming. The Human Torch also appeared in this comic, but different Human Torch from what you know. With comic books, the sales on them kept going up and up, especially during World War II was when they hit their peak. I saw a documentary called The History of DC Comics once. Have any of you guys hear of DC Comics? They make lousy movies. Anyway, it's a shame, but they make lousy movies. Great television, lousy movies. In the history of DC Comics, they said that 30% of all the material shipped to soldiers overseas during World War II were comic books. So think about that, 2 books, 2 newspapers, 2 comic books. That was a heck of a lot of comic books. Comic book sales kept going up and up during the war, but then after peace was declared and the soldiers came home, they decided they didn't need superheroes anymore. I mean, they'd already defeated the Nazis. They didn't need superheroes anymore. So the returning GIs and most young men decided they wanted something a little bit more intense. So the kind of comics that they turned to were things like crime comics and horror comics. And some of those, you're seeing somebody get shot in the head over there and an electric chair. They were pretty gory things. And they kept getting gorier and gorier until 1954 when this gentleman, Frederick Wortham, came out with a book called Seduction of the Innocent. And, this book proved conclusively that comic books were the cause of juvenile delinquency. And its theory was, you get rid of comic books, you'll have no more juvenile delinquents, and eventually you will eliminate all crime. You know? What?
Seems like a solid.
It was a very solid premise, because Dr. Wortham had, you know, he was working with juvenile delinquents, and he found out that most juvenile delinquents read comic books. So they were obviously the cause of the juvenile delinquency. Brilliant man. He forgot to notice that most of the non-juvenile delinquents also read comic books in those days. And, you know, that's a technicality that he didn't slip into his book. But, you know, it was worth a shot. Get rid of comic books, you get rid of crime. Yeah, okay, maybe next time. Anyway, after Wortham, the only comic books left were the comic books aimed at little kids. Now, up until this point, you know, young men, soldiers, adults, they were reading comic books, the reprints of newspaper strips. Now, according to Wortham, newspaper strips were still fine. Comic books, however, were the work of the devil. I don't know the difference, but he did. You know, superheroes kind of went away after Wortham, and they stayed away for a whole 2 years. And in 1956, an editor by the name of Julie Schwartz, a very sweet curmudgeon who used to, you know, growl at me when I come near his office, he brought back The Flash. Now, Julie had been an old science fiction fan. He eventually became a literary agent. He represented guys like Ray Bradbury. You guys know Ray Bradbury? Yeah. Thank God. All right. And was hired as a comic book editor. And because of his science fiction background, he made sure that every new character had kind of a science fiction background. So he brought back all the old heroes, revamped them, made sure they now had science fiction kind of roots. The Flash, he was a police scientist, got lightning hit some chemicals. The chemicals fell on him, and suddenly he could just run fast. I don't know. All right. Anyway, Julie brought back superheroes. Now, this is, you know, up until now it's been hopefully a not too boring history lesson. Now here's where it gets personal. I told you they had Sunday comics and daily comic books. Kids read the Sunday comic books, the Sunday comics, the Sunday funnies as they were called back in my day. I know because I was one of those kids. I don't know how old I was, 5 or 6, when I first, you know, saw the Sunday funnies, and I got hooked right away. Every Sunday, my father would go out and he'd buy, you know, 1 or 2 newspapers, Sunday newspapers. I tried to convince him to buy all of them. Never worked. I think, you know, he was concerned about certain politics in some of the papers. I didn't care. You know, one of the papers he didn't like had Prince Valiant. I wanted Prince Valiant. Couldn't convince him to buy it. But every Sunday, I'd steal the Sunday comics, I'd spread them out on the floor, and just read them all. Didn't matter if it was a soap opera or an adventure comic, a science fiction comic, a humor comic. The magic of comics somehow or other just hooked me. The interplay between the words and the pictures just got to me. Which, you know, at 5 or 6, that's the perfect age for that sort of thing. After a while, I realized that I didn't have to wait till Sunday for the comics. That they were, you know, I suddenly realized comics were appearing every day in my father's daily newspapers. So naturally, I started cutting up my father's newspapers. This led to certain problems between me and my father I don't want to go into. He was not too happy about about me cutting up his papers, but hey, come on, I was into the comics. And I remained a comic book fan, a comic strip fan, up until, actually, sorry about that. Since we're talking about comic strips, I should mention some great comic strips to you guys. Because, like I say, I don't know what kind of culture you have, so I'm trying to help you out. One of the greatest adventure comic strips of all time, Terry and the Pirates by Milton Caniff. A lot of these things are being reprinted these days. This was just beautifully drawn, beautifully written, full of excitement, full of soap opera. The main villain, and some would say the main character, was this lovely dark-haired lady here in the corner, known as the Dragon Lady. She had it all. Beautiful, sexy, brainy, manipulative. She had an army that obeyed every one of her commands. The term Dragon Lady is still used these days. Last time I heard it, they were referring to Nancy Pelosi, but that's something else. Little Abner by Al Cap. How many of you guys have heard of Sadie Hawkins Day? All right, that comes from Little Abner, by Al Cap. Again, this was a humor strip, but fun nonsense. Dick Tracy. What is that sound? It's not like I ate a lot of vegetables today. So, Dick Tracy by Al Cap. In 1946, he introduced the two-way wrist radio. Can you imagine a communication device on your wrists in 1946? That's, 20-some-odd years after the invention of the telephone. Dick Tracy had one. He ended up upgrading it to a two-way wrist TV in 1964. I think Apple is still working on that one. Prince Valiant, the comic strip that I couldn't convince my father to buy the Sunday newspaper for. Probably the most beautifully drawn comic strip of all time. And this thing had it all. Beautiful princesses, dragons, knights in shining armor, total adventure. Great stuff when you're, 10, 12 years old. And even pretty good stuff these days. Now I can just look at the pictures and really appreciate the amount of work that good old Hal Foster put into that stuff. All right, now, around the time I was, I'm going to say 7 or 8, I was at some sort of family function. I don't remember what it was, but one of my cousins handed me this magical thing called a comic book. In it, it had this scary character called the Batman, which frightened the hell out of me. I think I've never been a big Batman fan because of the first time I saw him. Man, this guy was mysterious, spooky, wasn't sure what he was all about. But I love this thing called comic books. And I thought, wow, if there's one, there might be others. And I started to hunt around, and I discovered that at my local candy store, that's what we called them in New York, they were a combination of card shops, they sold cards, candies. A lot of them had soda fountains, but they all had a big rack of comic books. And they were on every street corner. So I discovered comic books in this candy store, and again, I'm really hooked. I'm in love again. These things are fantastic. I bought, every kind of comic book I could get my hands on. Now, in those days, you could buy a candy bar for a nickel. A dime would get you either an ice cream pop or a comic book. Guess who gave up ice cream pops and candy bars? Because all my money went to comic books. Like I said, I tried them all. Hot Stuff, Superboy, The Adventures of Superman. As a boy, come on, who could argue with that? The Fly. It's a young man with insect-like powers. Sound familiar? Sugar and Spike, 2 babies who were smarter than their parents. I knew that because I was smarter than my parents. Or at least I thought I was. like I said, bought them all, loved them all, had a great time with them. Now, as I grew a little older, my reading taste started to change. Now, comic books, which I loved when I was 6 and 7, as I got a little older, ripe old age of 8, 9, 10, I started reading other things. The Hardy Boys. This is my first PowerPoint thing, believe it or not. So some of these images are kind of crummy. But I had to try it, come on. My 10-year-old niece can do PowerPoint. I figured I should be able to do it. I also got hooked on this guy called Edgar Rice Burroughs. I know all of you people have read Edgar Rice Burroughs, right? Have any of you read Edgar Rice Burroughs? Come on, you should all read Edgar Rice Burroughs. Edgar Rice Burroughs, really a lousy writer, but a fabulous storyteller. One of his stories, I think, At the Earth's Core, tells about this guy who owned a mine. So he hired this guy to build a machine that could dig underground. And they get into the machine and they're testing it for the first time. And then they realize that it's going straight, burrowing straight down towards the center of the earth. And they're trapped because they can't turn the machine up. These guys are heading for the center of the earth. They're trapped. And all this happens on the first page of the book. Talk about jumping into a story. What I really loved about Edgar Rice Burroughs is all of his books were essentially romances. There was a hero, there was some beautiful girl that he was in love with, and there was a whole cast of characters, and he would structure the story so you'd have 3 or 4 pages of excitement building up, and somebody would be in big trouble, and then you'd cut away to somebody else. And 3 or 4 pages, and they would be in trouble. Then you'd cut away to somebody else. And he kept cutting away and moving you along. So you'd read 150 pages, and you'd be exhausted by the end of it, and it's, one adventure after another adventure. It was cliffhangers, one after the other, filling up a novel. That's how, I always look back and I think that's how I learned how to plot stories and how I learned, the concept of story structure. When I was 8 years old, I wasn't thinking that way, but, later on I could figure it out. Now, around the time I was getting to be 10 or 11, I was outgrowing comics. The DC Comics, the guys who make lousy movies, not that we're casting aspersions, they were, pretty much very plot heavy, and after a while they got boring. But at I think it was at age 11, I went to the candy store one day and I saw 2 comic books on the stands next to each other. Fantastic Four. Now, originally I thought, that must mean there's 4 stories in the book. But I noticed the Human Torch on both covers and thought, wait a minute, this is a superhero team. Let me try them. Yeah, that was a mistake. That was a mistake. That ended up directing my whole life towards comics. Because these things were filled with action and adventure and intensity I had never seen before. And they blew my 10-year-old mind, or 11-year-old mind. Again, I'm a little fuzzy on that. And I was just hooked on these things. What I had not realized was that gentlemen by the name of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby had started what history now calls the so-called Marvel Age of Comics. And they had decided to up the ante. Before Stan and Jack, comic books were aimed, mainly at the 6 to 10-year-olds. Stan and Jack, and whether intentionally or unintentionally, and since I met these guys, I can tell you, probably very unintentionally, aimed the comics older. They were aiming for 13 to 16-year-olds. Again, it was kind of a happy accident. But they put more intensity, more action, real feelings, real dialogue. You had sweet guys like the Hulk. And they made their comic books about something. Like the Hulk was always about a guy who was constantly at war with himself, who was constantly, battling his inner demons, his inner feelings. I was intrigued. And then came, Spider-Man. I'm sure you guys have all heard of Spider-Man. I'm sure you guys have all heard that famous line, with great power comes great responsibility. You guys all know that line? Yes. Congratulations, it's wrong. It's the wrong line. They got it wrong. I don't know why people keep getting it wrong. As you see in the second panel, the line is actually, with great power, there must also come great responsibility. Hey, we all know people with great power have absolutely no responsibility. That's basically telling Peter Parker, hey, you got the great power, it's up to you to make sure that you use it responsibly. And that was that was an important message to an 11-year-old. Because from that point on, I figured, I have to be a little bit more responsible. Yeah, like it really took. But anyway, Spider-Man was my character. He was a teenager. I wasn't quite a teenager, but I knew I was eventually going to be a teenager. And I figured, maybe I can run across a radioactive spider. Maybe not. Aside from Spider-Man, they introduced a whole bunch of other characters. I'm sure you guys have seen all the movies, Iron Man, Thor, Ant-Man, especially Ant-Man. I had a character in that movie, so every time you guys watch that movie, I get a couple of cents. Watch it again. Like I said, the Marvel movies, not the Marvel movies, the Marvel characters, much more intense, much more action-oriented, and these things were very popular in the 60s. They're even more popular today because a lot of you people, I'm sure, go to the movies but have never even read any of these comic books. True? Yeah, I know it's true. All right. Now, here's a nice thing about Marvel. They started aiming at 16-year-olds, and then they started getting older and older. And they were doing it as I was getting older and older. Yeah, it was really lucky for me. They started coming out with, Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian. This is sword and sorcery, pretty vicious stuff, for a 12-year-old. The Silver Surfer, which was Stan Lee's philosophical text. Silver Surfer would stand up and he had these long, philosophical soliloquies from issue to issue. Stan would never shut up. All he wanted to do is talk about the nature of humanity, the nature of, the nature of sin, the nature of this, the nature of that. But these were exciting comic books as a kid. And they kept, kept hooking me, and, I still love this nonsense. Now, my love for comics eventually led me to read 3 books, which I can't recommend highly enough. Now, the first one was The Great Comic Book Heroes by Jules Feiffer. It originally came out in 1965 and had all sorts of reprints of original comic books in it. But he told what the, up until then was the first history of comics. The book was later reprinted. That's the cover of the reprint there. That one doesn't have all the comics in it. But it's still worth reading for the history lesson that Jules gives. Now, this was very important to me for it was my first exposure to history of comics, and also my first exposure to two very important characters. One was Plastic Man by Jack Cole. This is a character who, like Mr. Fantastic, could stretch, form himself into any object. Jack had this very weird sense of humor, and really stretched the boundaries of comics. Not intentional, not intentional. Yeah. So I'm a writer. I communicate better in second draft. The second draft of this speech will be much better. Anyway. Anyway, Jack, some of you guys may know Jack because for many years he was a cartoonist in Playboy magazine. I'm sure some of you guys have read Playboy magazine over the years. Or that might have just been my generation. I don't know. The other important character and creator for me was Will Eisner's spirit. Now, this became very, very important to me over the years because Will Eisner basically taught me how to tell little morality plays in 7 pages or less. Now, that may not seem to be much, but if you're a writer, you have to know how to tell your story succinctly. And that's what Will Eisner taught me. I didn't realize it at the time. Again, most of these things I was just reading them thinking, hey, this is great stuff. But years later, I look back and say, oh man, I got that from Will Eisner. The second book, this is a very important book. I'm sure all of you people have read it. The Pogo, election extra. It's very pertinent considering that we just had an election. Now, how many of you people know who Pogo is? Not enough of you. Pogo was a beautifully illustrated strip filled with regular hysterical humor, political humor, satire, simply and beautifully drawn. It was by a gentleman by the name of Walt Kelly. This is my favorite comic strip of all time. I cannot recommend it highly enough. If you ever get a chance to read any of the Pogo books, they're reprinting the comic strip. They've got a whole bunch of books. This stuff was really great. Any of you guys ever read Calvin and Hobbes? This was Calvin and Hobbes before Calvin and Hobbes. As a matter of fact, Bill Watterson has often talked about Walt Kelly as one of his main inspirations. The third book, He Done Her Wrong by Milton Gross. This was published in 1930. I picked up a reprint somewhere along the line. It's a 250-page wordless graphic novel, published in 1930, and is a textbook on visual storytelling. If you're interested in doing comics, working in movies, television not so much because television is more word-oriented, but anything that depends mainly on pictures, this is the textbook you got to read. One time I walked into a used bookstore and they were selling copies of this thing at $1 a piece, so I bought every copy they had. And I went back to Marvel and I gave one to every editor on staff, and I kept passing them out to writers and artists. I accidentally passed out my own copy, which was a stupid mistake on my part, not the only one I've made, sadly. But I managed to pick up another bunch of copies as time goes on. And anytime I find them at used bookstores or anywhere else, pick up every copy I can find and hand them out to people who are interested in visual storytelling, of any kind of visual storytelling. And now we're going to read some comics. All right? This is the story of Gerhard Schnabel by Will Eisner. It's a 7-page story. I was lazy, so I only put 5 of the pages on this thing. We're not going to read them all, but we're going to read the first page. Before we begin this story, we want to make one point very clear. This is not a funny story. We mean to give you a simple account of Gerhard Schnabel, beginning at the point when he first discovered he could fly. Please, no laughter. Gerhard discovers he can fly. He's like any kid. He's very excited about this. Hey, he can fly. How many guys dreamed or wished that you could fly at some point in your life? All of you, come on. Anybody who didn't is a stiff. Get out of here. So Gerhard told his parents he could fly. They reacted not so happily about that. They basically spanked him and said, you got to keep this a secret, otherwise people are going to think you're a freak. So he spent his whole life trying to be a regular guy. Got a job in a bank as a security guard. Unfortunately, one night the bank is robbed by a bunch of robbers. Gerhard is fired. Guy's very depressed. What's he going to do now? Well, he's going to show the world that he is special. He's going to go out and fly. He's going to go to the highest building in the city, and he's going to fly. Unfortunately for him, the bank robbers are trying to avoid the spirit who's chasing him. They chase him up the same building. Like I said, 7 pages, and there's a gunfight. And who gets shot? Good old Gerhard. You know, and so lifeless. Gerhard Schnabel, flooded earthward, but do not weep for Schnabel. Rather shed a tear for mankind, for not one person in the entire crowd that watched his body being carted away knew or even suspected that on this day, Gerhard Schnabel had flown. That's a real kick in the head, that story. It can really, reading the whole story, and if you get the chance, read the whole story. It's an emotional thing. See this scene of Gerhard with the smile on his face floating upward? First time I read the story, that was not there. Will Eisner added that later on. And I asked him why he added it. And he said, because too many people cry at the end of this and are miserable. So he added that happy face so they wouldn't be miserable. And I said to him, Will, you just made me miserable. You did it right the first time. Now here's another story. This is a 5-pager. It's an Archie story. Yeah, Archie stories, they're ridiculous, goofy stories. It's called 2 Words, and you can see which 2 words. Archie, Veronica. Veronica sees a pretty girl walking past, and what's her first thing? Archie. Whoa, Archie! Veronica! Archie! Veronica! Archie! Veronica! Hey, Archie! Veronica! Veronica? Veronica! Veronica! Veronica? Veronica! Archie! Veronica? Archie! Veronica! Archie? Veronica. Archie. Veronica. Veronica. Archie. Veronica. Archie. Veronica. Archie. Veronica. Archie. Veronica. Now, I worked for Archie Comics for a while. And we used to do goofy stories like this all the time where we would play with the medium. I remember doing one story where I just used one word. I don't remember which one that one word was. The guy, Frank Doyle and Harry Lucy, these were 2 of the best guys. Other guys, Dan DiCarlo, who, when you guys think of Betty and Veronica, the good girl artist, that's Dan DiCarlo. There was also Sam Schwartz, who worked on Jughead mainly. Sam was a character. When we worked on Jughead together, he would call me up at 3 o'clock in the morning to discuss gags. I was not too receptive at 3 o'clock in the morning. I used to threaten him. He thought I was kidding. Anyway, again, playing with the medium. These goofy little things that we can do. Now here's a 3-page sequence that I was involved with the legendary, well, not so legendary, Rampaging Ron Friends and Joltin' Joe Sinnott. These two of my goofball friends. This was in a Thor book. The character we're focusing on is a gentleman by the name of Eric Masterson. We've established that Eric is working with Thor for months now. Eric has been, he's a single father. He's been in a custody battle with his ex-wife. He's trying desperately to keep hold of his son. And then he finds out that he and Thor have to travel to a distant galaxy for what is probably a suicide mission. Thor, of course, doesn't think in terms of suicide missions because he's Thor. He always wins. Eric is thinking, hey, I'm just a regular human. If anybody gets squashed, I'm the sidekick. So Eric doesn't think he's going to come back from this mission. So at his custody battle, he shows up, and in the 4th panel he says, it's over, Marcy, you've won. He gives up his son because he has to help Thor. He's acting responsibly. He then says goodbye to his son. They have an emotional farewell. He hopes that someday he'll be able to, get his son back. But since he doesn't think he's coming back, he's not so sure about it. And spoiler, he never does get his son back. The son leaves with the ex-wife, and then good old Eric he's been trying to be tough all along. The door closes, his son is gone, and then he collapses in his buddy's arms. This is a lesson I learned from Will Eisner. I just wanted to show you guys, the Will Eisner stuff, I learned how to do it from Will. Nice emotional scene. Years later, I've had people come to me up at comic book conventions, and they still remember this scene. Here's another one from an issue of Spider-Girl. In this issue, we had established that there's a villain who strikes from the air and is robbing people and swoops down and grabs people. If you look at the artwork shows a courier. Somebody yanks him up into the air. He's chained to a briefcase that is holding, we discover, diamonds. He's in pain. The briefcase breaks. He falls. That's what the artwork says. The copy, however, it says, I gotta get to an angle so I can read this thing. I used to have this on a small computer screen, so it's hard to read. Theo Rodolfo is a courier who works primarily in the Diamond District. For 27 years, he has delivered precious stones and even more precious documents. His mind, however, is on his wife. They met at a church dance almost 30 years ago, and have continued to dance through all the years of their, sometimes till much, yeah, you guys got it. Pronunciation, not my strong suit. I spend most of my days locked in a room by myself. What do I know? Mumbling at the computer. Today is their civil wedding anniversary. From his youngest daughter to his eldest son, the entire family has returned home for the big celebration. Unfortunately for Theo, poor Theo will miss tonight's party. Instead of dancing with his beautiful Linda, he will be struggling to breathe through a tube in his throat. It will be months before he can walk, and he will never dance again. All right? Gut punch. Theo is the very different definition of what we call a throwaway character. This is the only page he ever appears in a comic book. But when you get involved in the craft of comics, you realize that everybody's got to be very important or they don't belong there. So we tried to make this character as important as we could because we wanted you guys to get a gut punch. We wanted you guys to have an emotional reaction to what happens to Theo. Again, you're never going to see him again. Goodbye, Theo. Goodbye. All right. And now I'm going to show you one panel that completely defines Captain America. Captain America is being held by the Submariner, who's super strong, about to toss him into outer space or dash him against a wall. I forget what it was. And, Submariner has his line, "I have toiled enough indignities this day. I've tolerated enough indignities this day. Now my vengeance shall be swift and sure and without mercy." And, I know what I'd be thinking then. Holy shit, I'm dead. What does Captain America think? He's stronger than me. Yeah? But I'll find a way to outmaneuver him. And to me, this is Captain America. I'll find a way. That one panel tells you everything you need to know about this character. It's one of the things I love about comics. In one panel, we can give you the entire personality and rationale of any character. In one page, we can give you the life story, the most important thing you need to know about a character. In 3 pages, we can show you the worst day of a character's life. And in 5 pages, we can make you laugh over two words. In 7 pages, we can give you a story that will haunt you forever. These are wonderful things about comic books, huh? I think so. So the question, why comics? All right, I realize now, it's the wrong question. I should ask, why not comics? Because when you get right down to it, what are comics? We're just a tool. It's a storytelling tool. It's just a way to tell stories or express ideas. Humans, as we've established earlier, have been telling stories ever since there were humans. It's part of the human behavior, may even be part of our DNA. And why do we like stories? We like stories because they bring a sense of order out of the chaos of existence. Stories make sense, and sometimes real life doesn't. Sometimes random things happen in real life. Random doesn't work in stories. Everything in a story has to mean something. A lot of people believe that everything in life means something. Yeah, I'm not so sure that, you bought an ice cream cone today, and yesterday you bought an ice cream pop. I don't think there's a lot of meaning in that. But if it was a story, those 2 actions would mean something, because they have to mean something. Like I said, random doesn't work in fiction. And that's why we love stories. They make sense. They might not make sense the way we want them to make sense, but everything in a story has a purpose. And if it doesn't have a purpose, it doesn't belong in your story. Now, I mentioned earlier, when I was a kid, comic books were for sale everywhere. They became my gateway to literacy. I started with comics, moved up to junk fiction, because, Hardy Boys, Edgar Rice Burroughs, junk. but fun junk. And I believe in junk. I believe in mystery novels. I believe in romance novels. I believe in science fiction novels and horror stories and all that junk. Because they're fun. And if you keep reading them, eventually you want something more and you'll read the so-called good stuff. Some of the good stuff I'm not so crazy about, but some of the good stuff is really good stuff. Comic books started me on the path, and I'm still on that path. I still read at least a book a week, still go to the library a few times a month. I'm hooked. Still like my old comics. Some of the new ones, not so much. And comics, they do a lot of things. How many of you guys have read Mouse? All right, so you know what Mouse is. It's a book about the Holocaust. And, it's a pretty important book and pretty good book. I'm sure most of you have not read Will Eisner's Gleeful Guide to Communicating with Plants, but that's a book that, it's a how-to book on how to raise plants properly. Both comics. 666. This is a book about insecurity and how to deal with insecurities by Jules Feiffer. Yeah, how many people, you guys know who Jules Feiffer is? Come on. You gotta fix the curriculum here. Jules Feiffer, famous cartoonist, written a lot of movies, a lot of plays. Phantom Booth, a ton of things. I mean, you probably read his books when you were a child. Aside from Phantom Booth, I can't think of one off the top of the head, but he's done so many books, so many movies, so many plays. And like I said, this is a book about insecurities and how to deal with insecurity. Will Eisner, this is Contract with God. It's a book about faith and dealing with people without faith and just dealing with people in general. No superheroes, no masked characters in that book. Comic books, comics, they inspire us. They make us want to be better than we are. I wanted to be like Captain America when I was a kid. I figured, whenever there's a problem, let me find a way to solve it. I wanted to be like Spider-Man. I wanted to be a responsible kid. An irresponsible adult, but a responsible kid. Infinity War. All right, this was a comic book before it was a movie. And, how many of you guys have seen Infinity War? All right. Started a comic book. These guys stretched the imagination. Watchmen. I know a lot of you people a lot of you people. How many Watchmen? All right, well, Watchmen turned the whole superhero genre on its head. It made us question everything we believed about superheroes. And beautifully drawn book. Comic books can touch our hearts. They can do stories that haunt us, that, make us, really have another view of the human situation. But I think when it comes to comics, the most important thing they can do is entertain us. Getting Married and Other Mistakes by a buddy of mine, Barbara Slate, basically explains why cartoonists should never get married. My wife occasionally agrees. Cosmo, the Merry Martian. This is a goofball comic that was done in the 50s by a guy with a really deranged sense of humor. It's a parody, satire on science fiction movies told from the Martian's point of view. Because he was scared by all these things called humor. I think they just came out with a book called Smallfoot, which is you know, I'm sure the authors grew up on Cosmo the Merry Martian. You know, comics are fun. They can instruct us, they can entertain us. Theodore Sturgeon, who's a noted science fiction writer, all you guys have read Theodore Sturgeon, right? Yeah, just humor me and shake your head. All right, famous science fiction writer. You know, he once said 90% of everything is crap. Whatever it is, 90% of it is crap. Now, when it comes to comics, I'll concede 90% of comics produced could be considered crap. But that last 10% in the hands of a master can really get you where you live, can stick with you forever. You know, I read comic books as a kid. I can still remember the scenes. I can still remember what I thought when I first saw it. I told you Will Eisner had changed the last panel of that Schnabel story. Well, the first time I saw that, I was like 11 years old. At the time I confronted Will, I was probably in my 40s. And all those years had gone by, and when I saw the new version, I said, well, what'd you do? Because it stuck with me all those years. Now, those of you who've read comics probably have similar scenes in your head. A lot of people always remember their first comic book. That Batman panel, that's probably not from my first Batman. I just read a random Batman thing because I don't know which Batman comic book was the first one I saw. But I definitely remember Fantastic Four, 3 and 4. Those things are, imprinted in me. Like I said, I fell in love with the medium. I'm a very lucky guy because as a young kid, I knew I wanted to tell stories. I knew I wanted to be a writer. And as an older kid, I actually got to work in the comic book industry. And I can tell you that I had a blast. I think I've unofficially retired from the comic book industry. I think I did that a few months ago. I'm not sure because I could still get suckered into doing something. Because I'm a big lollipop and I'm often suckered into doing things. But I'm still reading comics, still reading all my junk fiction, still reading all the other stuff. Anyway, guys, that's why I love comics. And that's why I care about comics. I hope you guys do too.
I think Tom's going to have to answer questions. I think his mic might be better. If this one's not working. Maybe you should use this one.
Right. Is this not working?
I think they're having trouble with their audio. So
Oops.
you can go with that one.
Sorry.
And what I'll do is I'll grab a microphone. If you all have questions, you can pose them, and I'll walk around.
Yeah, chased all you guys out. Thanks for staying to the end. Hey. What time is it? Okay.
First, thanks for talking. So one of the things that I've noticed recently, or at least in other people's lives, people who I know are very big into the arts, there seems to be a huge disparity between what people like movies and comic books and all these things that are artistically based that people spend so much money to go see and so much money to invest in, but yet the art industry in general is typically looked down upon by a lot of people. Like, oh, well, you're going to be a starving artist, or arts, you should go get a real job. I've heard, like, that's a stereotype, but it's true. I've heard people say it, and I was wondering, what did you think? Like, in an industry that's so important as part of our culture, and an industry that people seem to highly value, I was wondering if you, like, why do you think we have that problem that people, it's just so weird.
It's, all right, I know what your question is. I have to get myself under control so I don't laugh out loud first.
Yeah.
Because when you talk about comics as being such an important thing, and that sort of thing, when I got into comic books, we were one step above the pornographers. You know, we were doing the work of the devil. I remember when I told my father I got offered a job at Archie Comics, his reaction was, "You went to college to write comic books?" And then he asked me the biggest question, "You think you can actually make a living at it?" I said, "I don't know, Dad." He goes, "Well, you're young. Try it. If it doesn't work, you can always come work at the supermarket." Because, like I said, when I got into comics, nobody thought they were going to make any money. For years, I was always warned, if you were going to do any work for television or work on a movie or that sort of thing, hey, kid, keep it quiet that you work on comics. Nobody wants to hear that. It's better you tell them you're unemployed. Now to your question in terms of the arts. The problem with any of the arts, whether it's writing, drawing, you want to make movies, you want to be a singer, a lot of people want to do that stuff. And some people make a living at it, some people barely hang on, and some people go nowhere. Now, I think a lot of the people who go nowhere just like the idea of being a writer or an artist or a singer, and they're not willing to put in the real work. If you want to be a writer or an artist, and you don't like the concept of being locked up in a room by yourself for 10 to 12 hours a day, you're in the wrong field. Because that's what you're going to have to do. If you're going to be a singer, you've got to be practicing every freaking day. And there's no guarantee, because no matter how good you are, a certain amount of luck, has to break your way. And if the right luck breaks your way, then you'll be able to support yourself in this business. If the wrong luck breaks your way, you're just going to be one of the other people. And it's hard. And people who aren't in the arts don't understand the arts. They know that there are a handful of people that make money, and there's a whole bunch of people that don't. And what makes you special? Well, you make you special. And you believe in yourself, and if you can do the most important thing in any sort of artistic career, which is finish what you start, you got a chance of making it. If you cannot finish what you start, you will have no chance of making it. Now that sounds very glib. But I can tell you, as a guy who's written bunches of stories, bunches of novels, bunches of all sorts of stuff, no matter what you're working on, at some point you hit this wall, which I refer to as the hump. And once you hit that wall, that separates, the amateurs from the professionals. Because you think, hey, this is going to be the greatest story I've ever written. This is going to be terrific. This is going to be, oh my God, this is going to be a piece of shit. And a professional says, all right, I got to just fight my way through this one, finish it, and then the next one will be the greatest piece of work I've ever done. And that's what professionals do. We lie to ourselves, we lie to each other, but we finish what we start. If you can finish what you start, you got a real good chance of eventually making enough money to support yourself. And here's a very important piece of advice, makes me a very crass, commercialistic kind of guy. Whatever you love doing, whether it's writing, drawing, building cabinets, digging holes, whatever it is, you have to get paid for doing it. Because if you don't get paid doing it, you can't do it anymore. You'll have to go out and get another kind of job. If you like being an accountant, get paid being an accountant so that you can stay being an accountant. If you like being a writer, get paid being a writer so that you can stay being a writer and fill in all the other blanks. I hope I answered your question. Any other questions? There's a bunch of guys.
What kept you writing Mayday Parker after it had been canceled, put in the back of other issues, canceled again, then re-released, and finally collected? What kept you driven in writing throughout that time period when basically the market told you that, they didn't want it?
Well, actually a lot of the times the book was about to be canceled, it was just predictions by the sales department. Do you guys know what the direct market is? In the direct market, sales only go down. So, hate to say it, sales only go down. Wherever you start, they just go down. The sales department would look at Spider-Girl and say it's selling 35,000 copies a month now. In 8 months, this book is not going to make money. The sales will go down. So we have to cancel it in 8 months. 8 months would come by, they're all set to cancel it, then they look at the sales and say, wait a minute, Spider-Girl is now selling 42,000 copies a month. We're not going to cancel it. We're going to uncancel it. That's what kept happening to Spider-Girl. Now, as readers kept hearing Spider-Girl's about to be canceled, sales went up, we're going to be uncanceled. What kept me, I'm a sap. Whatever character I'm writing, I have to at some point fall in love with that character. I have to really care about that character. And right now, like I said, I'd be happy if I never had to write another comic book. But if Marvel called me up and said, hey, you want to do, Mayday Parker story? Yeah. I'd have to go back and do it because I love the character. And I love all the characters that I've done. I always tell people there's one secret to writing or to any sort of career that you love. You have to care about it. You have to care about what you're doing. And that's, Mayday Parker cared about her. I cared about her and all the other characters involved. It used to pain me to have to drop a mountain of shit on them every month. Make things miserable for me. Any other questions?
You've spoken a lot about the relationship between comic books and the modern and even previous film and television industry, and I think it's impossible not to mention it, especially in today's market. But what do you think comic books have to do to continue to distinguish themselves from this? Because a lot of people look at the movies and they say, well, I don't want to do comic books. I don't want to say that's me. Like, the movies are the same thing. It's just a picture to move. And, I roll my eyes, but a lot of people say it's true. So what do you think comic books have to do to keep that separation as their own, stories in the industry?
I think what comic books have to do is play to the strengths of their medium. And by that I mean, we can tell a complete story in 20 pages, 15 pages, 7 pages, 5 pages. And we have an unlimited budget. Where a comic book movie costs $100 million to do those special effects. Me, I just turn to around friends and say, hey, I need a space armada here. See you, won't you? And he says, never mind what he says. I can't repeat that. But he draws me a space armada. Or I say, you know, I've often wondered, what's in the space between molecules? Can you draw it? And never mind what he says. But he draws it. So, like I say, play to the strengths of the medium. One of the great things that people don't use too much anymore are thought balloons or narration captions. These are things comics have that no other medium has. Play to our strengths. As long as we're playing to our strengths, comics will always be here. Yes, sir.
So I wanted to know, what's it like working alongside other comic legends like Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and all the other great writers and artists throughout Marvel's history?
Okay, they're the actual great ones. All right, you're saying other great ones. Yeah, no, I don't fit into that category. But you know, it was cool. It was really cool. That's all I could say. I got to work with Stan a lot. I never got to work with Jack. I got to speak to him a couple of times, and I'm like, "Hi, Mr. Kirby, how are you?" I actually got to work with Steve Ditko. I was assigned this comic book called Machine Man, and Steve Ditko had been drawing it up till then, and the editor said, you know, the current writer left. I want you to write it. I said, is Ditko going to stay on? He said, no, Ditko wants to read the first plot. And I thought, okay, Ditko isn't going to draw the book. And I thought, there's no way I can write a plot that Steve Ditko is going to like. But I did my plot, did the best I could, had my phone number on the plot. In those days, I had my phone number on the plot. One day, I'm sitting at home, and I get a call, and this gruff voice says, "What gives you the right to write about heroes?" And I say, "Excuse me, who is this?" He says, "This is Steve Ditko." And then what followed was an hour and a half discussion, argument, whatever, about heroes and what is important about a hero and that sort of thing. At the end of that hour and a half, I'm totally exhausted. I started out thinking, Steve Ditko's on my phone. And by the end of it thinking, Steve Ditko's on my phone. And you know, he said to me, "This was fun, we got to do this again." And I'm going, "Yeah, right." And I just assumed he wasn't going to stay on it. He ended up staying on it to the end of the series. Steve Ditko and I became, you know, I think good friends. I used to keep a coffee pot in my office. He would often stop by and have a cup of coffee, and we'd sit there and discuss all sorts of crazy things, literature, that sort of stuff. People always ask me, "So what did he think about comics?" And I realized years later, we never once discussed comics. You know, I had Steve Ditko in my office. Never occurred to me to talk about comics. You know, politics, all sorts of other things. We had some great arguments, some great discussions. Really good guy, Steve Ditko. So what is it like to deal with these guys? It's really cool. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned several years ago about how comics are becoming more expensive, so you have to fit more story into each issue.
Comics have gotten more expensive,
Yeah.
and I wish they were putting more story in the story.
Is that something you
What? Yeah. But I'm not. My wife always says, "Be positive. Don't ever be negative." So I'm going to be positive. I positively believe that comic books today are not putting enough story in an issue, especially not for $4 a pop. I have problems with a lot of today's comics. And, okay, old fart, I accept it, you know. But two things bother me. One, they're not putting enough story in. For $4, you really got to be worth your reader's money and your reader's time. You know, some of these things, you know, you read a whole issue and nothing happens. The story hasn't begun yet. That annoys the heck out of me. Especially because when I started out, you know, they had just invented this thing called the wheel. Never going to work. Anyway, one of my early editors said to me, I was doing a mystery thing, he said, "Kid, I got to see a dead body by page 5. If I don't see a dead body by page 5, I'm not going to page 6, and neither are you." Stuck with me. All right? Now, but times have changed. Now I think you got to show that dead body by page 2 or 3. Because if you look around, all of media speeding up. You watch a movie, you got about a minute or half a minute maybe before something interesting has to grab you by the throat. You watch television, something immediately happens. You read any novel, that first sentence, if it doesn't grab you by the throat, you don't go to the second sentence. And yet comics, sometimes they think they don't have to grab you by the throat till the 3rd issue. I'm sorry. You don't catch me by the 1st page. I'm not going to the 2nd page. You know, again, I'm old. I like things to move faster because I don't have that much time left, guys. I want to get to the story. I don't want to wait a year to find out how this great story ends.
Well, if you're not much of time, you need to wrap up.
No, if anybody has any more questions. Yes, sir? Nah, yeah.
So I was just curious, with things like Watchmen and Mouse came out, how did that affect you as like a writer? Like, were you and the other writers who were working with able to like look at that and go, oh, we can try and push now for like darker stories or more intense stories? Like, what was kind of your reaction to that?
Well, I can give you my reaction because I know a number of guys who, you know, Watchmen said, "Oh yeah, we're going to do dark, gritty stories now," and I thought, yeah, I read Watchmen. I know this is heresy because everybody loves Watchmen. I was bored by most of it. I thought certain sections were great. I thought that pirate stuff, whenever I would get to that section, I just wanted to pass those pages. I thought the ending, which came out late, was stupid. So I thought it was beautifully drawn. I think the real hero of Watchmen is Dave Gibbons, because he told a fabulous visual story. I think, you know, my gut when I was reading Watchmen is they changed midstream. They were going one direction and then suddenly the thing kind of veered in another direction. And I think it was because everybody guessed what the original ending was going to be. And I've always had a different attitude about these things because you know, I exist on many planes of reality. And, you know, one of them is if I want to do dark and gritty stuff, I have so many other avenues to do dark and gritty stuff. So I just go write a murder mystery. I think, you know, comics, I thought, for my comics, I wanted, you know, action and angst in the mighty Marvel manner. A lot of hoo-ha adventures. A lot of what you see in the Marvel movies. Those are the kind of comic books that I enjoyed reading. Those are the kind of comic books I enjoyed doing. Like I said, dark and gritty didn't interest me. A lot of other guys said, "Oh man, he's got a chance to do dark and gritty," and I'm thinking, you got a chance to do dark and gritty whenever you want. There are 30 mystery magazines out there. Now there's only 2, but at the time there were plenty of places to do dark and gritty. You know? And Mouse is such a unique thing to itself. You know, I joked about how I learned lessons from Will Eisner, but I never tried to do Will Eisner because only Will Eisner could do Will Eisner. Okay. I know he taught for many years, but I used to look at his stuff and think, yeah, Will, nobody can learn looking at your stuff because only you can do your stuff. Joe Kubert is the other guy. Joe Kubert, the only guy in the industry who could do an inset panel and make it work. Goofy things. Anybody want to know the difference between an editor and a writer? All right? Editors, their job is to look at a character and think long term. What is the best thing for this character? Writers, their job is to do the best possible story they can. Short-term thinking. You've got short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. So editors and writers should always be clashing. If they're not clashing, something is wrong. You know, the difference between, creative people and salespeople. Salespeople know what sold last week. Creative people are supposed to create what's going to sell next week. Diametrically opposed, there should constantly be a clash. If there's not a clash, something is wrong. These are goofy things I've learned. Nobody else knows. Any other questions?
Hi, I heard a quote attributed to you during the 90s, the Marvel Revolution fiasco that was. It was in relation to the titles that were coming out. I believe it was something to the effect of, I don't care how many titles don't sell as long as we're making great comics or something to that effect. Do you still sort of hold on to that idea that the numbers isn't necessarily what matters, just so long as you're putting out excellent stories, or have your opinions sort of changed on that over the years?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure what that quote is, and I'm not sure what it, how it was, but my attitude was always, we have to, Marvel was a publishing company. And my attitude was, we have to make money as the publishing company. And as long as we're making money as the publishing company, by doing things like the X-Men and Spider-Man and Avengers, we had the leeway of experimenting with a whole bunch of other things. And trying, all sorts of other different comics, just to see if they worked. And, my attitude always was, and sometimes I was right, sometimes I was wrong. But if you did really good quality comics, they would sell. It's the old, if you build it, they will come. I always believe that you do a quality comic book, you will find a readership. I don't know if that answers your question, because I still believe it. I always believe that quality works. At least that's what I've always told myself, and quality often sells. One last question.
Who is your favorite literary author and why is it Douglas Adams?
See, Douglas Adams, I like him. He's junk. He's junk, but great junk. My favorite literary, I would have to say, when it comes to literary things, probably F. Scott Fitzgerald. I have no idea why, but every 2 or 3 years, I have to reread Great Gatsby, the Great Gatsby. And I think I must be a very stupid individual. Check with my wife, she'll confirm that. But every time I read it, I see something I never saw before. And I keep thinking, how many times do I have to read this before I really get it and understand it? So, like I say, F. Scott Fitzgerald, William Faulkner. I used to really love William Faulkner, but I've seen too many bad plays based on his work that have kind of tainted his stuff for me. You know, there was a version of A Sound and Fury that was just so bad it haunted me for a long time. But, you know, the basic classics. You know, in terms of other fiction, I'd be torn between Edgar Rice Burroughs, Robert E. Howard, and I was going to say Evan Hunter, but under his alias Ed McBain. How many of you guys know Ed McBain? He used to write a mystery series called The 87th Precinct. How many of you guys know Sin City or Frank Miller? Frank often copies from Ed McBain. One of my sins was I gave him his first couple of Ed McBain books. And I said, you want to do mystery stuff? Look at this stuff. I didn't mean you should copy. Anyway. Thank you guys for coming. I have just one last thing to tell you guys, which, you know, brutal confession. You know, that back in the day, when I really worked hard, you know, I'd be putting in 10, 12 hours a day, sometimes more. And, you know, unfortunately, I had deadlines, so I had to work 7 days a week. I never knew what this thing called weekends was. You know, over the years, I've slowed down a bit. You know, it's just 5 days a week. You know, I always had it in the back of my mind that at some point I'm going to run out of stories and I'm going to go, you know, I could always go do teaching. A number of my, you know, former colleagues have gone into teaching, and they told me the kind of work they have to put in, and I'm thinking, yeah, that's way too hard for me. Yeah, a guy who works 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, I look at teaching. I don't know how the heck these guys do it. I know your teachers probably aggravate the hell out of you on a regular basis, but they're putting in a lot of time that you guys don't know about. I think they, you know, deserve a, you know, a round of applause every once in a while. Yeah, I told you, I'm not doing teaching.
Very generous. Thank you very much. Thank you all for staying.
Thank you very much, guys.
So Thomas agreed to come out front, and he's going to sit down, and I know folks have brought some things, and there's also books to go if you want something signed. So we'll be out in the